Okay, but for your trip, so this looks right.
It is right. I was just told so. It's
Yeah, just use
these two.
that.
Yeah,
That's all
that's
right.
all. Okay, that's okay. And yeah, got water there. Good. Great. No, that's fine. Do whatever you want to do. I don't think a minute one way or another is going to make any difference to anyone. I mean, basically, there's one right there. Yeah, it's not physically. It isn't physically. It's not like one of those ones in. No. But I mean, it's right there. Yeah. The shuttle takes longer than walking. Yeah, it's right there.
Depending on the weather, though.
Yeah. Right. No, that is right. You need to obviously. So we'll keep an eye. So I guess. Read. Your back is breaking. My mother referred to those as one for flash shots. I don't think anybody, although I actually do make my students read this, and I do because I said, I'm not going to play games with you. I have opinions on these things. Figure it out before you come in. So it's better not to lie. This is the one that we're rewriting right now.
try really hard not to use those before
Oh, do they just get a video now?
yeah.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, but there's still,
I thought you meant, when I told Toronto we had walls that sort of folded away, and
oh, no.
you could turn it into four different style rooms.
Our new vendors that were students, they're like, wow.
Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Testing wireless mic C. Test 1 2.
No. Actually, sort of a little more. Who did it? Closed doors? Yeah. Oh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here on this Veterans Day. Appreciate your coming out and braving the potential weather. Today's talk, Assigning Protection, Can Refugee Rights and State Preferences Be Reconciled, is sponsored by the Institute for Global Security, Law, and Policy. My name is Avi Cover. I head up that center. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the number of people fleeing war, persecution, and conflict exceeded 70 million people in 2018. That is double the number from 20 years ago, and almost 2.5 million more than a year ago. And it corresponds, according to the UNHCR, to the population between that of Thailand and Turkey. In 2018, the number of refugees, people with a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, reached almost 26 million people worldwide, 500,000 more than in 2017. The countless images that we see of people fleeing, dying, of walls being built, interdiction at seas, and wealthy countries' payments to nearby poorer ones to house the refugees, suffuse our minds. So what can be done? What is the role of countries in our international system to care for, provide for, give shelter to, and pay for these displaced persons and refugees? Where do and how do our moral and legal obligations coexist and conflict with ideas of borders and national sovereignty? Are developing and developed nations sharing the burdens equitably or fairly? And how might we address the anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiments that would seem to call into question the international community's willingness to aid refugees? We are very fortunate today to have with us really one of the, if not the, leading expert on the law of refugee rights, Jim Hathaway. We're so lucky, and in part, this is a little bit payback, Jim, that I'm making you come and brave the elements, because last year when I went abroad, and I was working on refugee issues, I needed to take Jim's work to inform everything I did. So I was bringing these very heavy books. They sort of exceeded the 50-kilogram allotment. So in addition to back injuries and payment, we've got you here, and we're very fortunate. Professor Jim Hathaway is the James E. and Sarah Deegan Professor of Law, and as I said, a leading authority on international refugee law, whose work is regularly cited by the most senior courts of the common law world. Jim has a lot to say. You have his biography there. I'm not going to recite it all to you. Please join me in welcoming Jim Hathaway.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Cover and colleagues, for organizing my maiden voyage to Case Western. Very nice to be here. I should tell you, by the way, Avi, both of the books are e-books, so you could have saved your back. You know, So today we're going to do something a little different from what I know many of you engaged with refugee issues in the American context are used to thinking about. I'm not going to be talking about the southern border. We can talk about this in the discussion period afterward if you like. I want to try to take us to a different place because as difficult as circumstances now appear in our locality, what is being experienced on the U.S. southern border is the tiniest of tiny slivers of the horror of how the refugee system is falling apart globally. And I think one of the difficulties for Americans is that we do often tend to focus locally as opposed to thinking about the big picture. And today I am going to take you to that big picture because I think the context of this is really important. And what I want to show you is that we can fix the global refugee protection system in a way that will do more for refugees even as we take on board some of the legitimate concerns of states to which refugees flee. And so let me begin with the obvious. I think we do need a fix. The status quo is not an option. And the second point I'll make is that the way the United Nations has proposed dealing with that breakdown, what goes by the label the Global Compact on Refugees, was the thinnest of thin reforms and is not worth the paper it was written on in terms of actually beginning to address the problems. There is an answer, and I'm going to outline it for you based on the work of some 100 scholars and 6 governments over 5 years who came up with an alternative plan that I think at least I can sketch for you today, and then you can read more about it if you're interested. So let's start with the beginning. States really don't like it when people do what you see here, when people use smugglers to arrive unannounced at their borders. But take another close look at that picture. This was actually a boat that had come across the Mediterranean to Greece. Can you imagine that anybody on that boat liked being there? And yet, if your only choice is between a 50-50 shot of surviving the Mediterranean or a 100% shot of your house being destroyed in Syria with you inside it or indentured servitude in Eritrea, then getting on a boat like this looks pretty smart. And that's a very tragic reality. When refugees do arrive, these are people, let me emphasize, who, despite some of the rhetoric, are guilty of absolutely no crime other than availing themselves of something that we created, the right to seek asylum from the risk of being persecuted. When they do arrive, in answer to the regimes that we've created for them, too often they confront horrific conditions like this. Yet states overwhelmed by the arrival of refugees, often in places distant from major population centers, find it difficult to ensure dignified conditions of arrival. This has been a particular dilemma for Greece over the last few years. Most refugees actually want to lead productive lives. If you spend any time talking with refugees, the first thing you'll hear is that they not only want to meet their own needs and those of their families, but they're actually, in most cases, quite keen to contribute to the communities of which they are now a part. And yet, too often, though the numbers have been going down, still 1/3 of the world's refugee population lives in places like this, camps where they can make absolutely no contribution to their own welfare, much less that of their neighboring communities. And even when they can get out of camps, the overwhelming majority are eking out bare livelihoods in the hellholes of urban slums, which the United Nations thinks is progress. I don't think so. Making it worse still, the developed world squanders unconscionable sums of money to run the present refugee system. And you really need to think about this. I've had some very interesting conversations with very conservative lawmakers who are willing to think about the issue when they hear this, that we are now spending more money to manage and process the refugee claims of the roughly 15% of refugees who get to rich countries than we spend on the 85% who are in the less developed world. In fact, the number is that we spend 4 times as much on the 15% who arrive in rich countries as we do on people in places like these. Now, that's not even on the ethical Richter scale. 4 times as much on 15% as you do for the other 85%. That's money, and I don't mean to speak against my/our profession, but this is money going to bureaucrats and lawyers and judges and officials rather than to refugees. And I don't think that's an ethical proposition. Worst of all, and yes, it continues to get worse, there are presently some 13 million refugees, which is 2/3 of the world's refugees, who have been waiting in places like the countries highlighted here in what are called protracted refugee situations. That means, on average, they've been waiting at least 20 years for a solution with no solution in sight. Think about that. I visited a refugee camp where it was now the 3rd generation being born behind barbed wire. You want to create a terrorist threat, cage people up like animals, and that's what we do for generation after generation after generation. Of those 13 million people who've been waiting for at least 20 years, the whole world together resettles less than 100,000 every year, less than 1% of the number who've been waiting for an average of 20 years. Almost all of those go to only 3 countries. We used to be able to say that the United States was the leader. We can't say that anymore. Australia and Canada have passed by on per capita numbers. The US remains involved. But quite frankly, those 3 countries are the only countries resettling any significant numbers of refugees in the world today. And so an absolutely essential part of the refugee journey, finding a place for people to remake their lives when they can't go home after a few years of waiting, is simply not being done. So we leave people waiting forever. So the bottom line is that the current refugee system is a complete mess. It's risky for refugees and the countries to which they flee. It's chaotic. It's debilitating for the humans involved. It's absurdly expensive, and it doesn't produce solutions for most refugees. So if there were a bankruptcy lawyer in the room, I'm sure she would be saying right now, it's time to file for bankruptcy on this system. It simply has passed the point of functionality. And yet, sadly, this leads to my second point. To the extent that anyone has suggested a change, the change has been what I call thin. In other words, papering over this tragic reality with the veneer of progress despite persisting dysfunctionality. When the UN finally got engaged on this issue after the so-called refugee crisis in Europe 4 years ago, the UN Refugee Agency, which had a not insignificant vested interest in managing this process, demanded and got control of the refugee reform process. It's a little bit like the fox looking after the hen house. Their system had been falling apart. Who's going to fix it? They are. And what they came up with, what goes by the name of the so-called grand title, Global Compact on Refugees, adopted almost a year ago, quite frankly, is not remotely comprehensive. To start with, the fix for the system that governments adopted a year ago only applies to so-called large movements of refugees. Now, interestingly, large, every good lawyer in the room should be asking herself or himself, what is a large movement? Guess what? We didn't bother defining it. So is that 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? Australia thought there was a mass arrival when 300 people showed up. Tanzania admitted more than 1 million refugees in less than 36 hours without complaining. Whose standard governs? And secondly, even if the situation is deemed to be large, it's kind of like buying eggs or something, the principles of the so-called compact are just guideposts for a series of discussions. There's not one binding word in the entire compact. It's what, as lawyers, we would call an agreement to agree, which your contracts prof, I'm sure, taught you, doesn't add up to much of an obligation, right? So what we've got is the thinnest of thin reforms. Every situation, if it's large, will have a series of conversations involving a certain number of guideposts about how to fix it. We are going to have, get ready for this, it's amazing. We're going to have global refugee summits. We will have national steering groups. We will have solidarity conferences. We will have, I'm just getting started. We will have global support platform meetings. We will have host country consultative mechanisms. We will have regional mechanisms. And lest any academic feel left out, yes, there will be a global academic network. In other words, we are going to have lots and lots and lots of chats, but no action. No action guaranteed. What a wonderful way, and here I'm being slightly more serious, and this makes me really sad as someone who's worked with human rights lawyers and NGOs my entire professional life. This was a great system of co-opting NGOs and academics who are going to have seats at lots and lots and lots of tables. Interestingly, refugees barely get invited. So why were we presented with such a tepid response when the need for reform is so obvious? When that's the reality, having a series of rotating conversations seems pretty lame. UNHCR says, well, the time is not right. Things are bad in the world. We need to consolidate traditional standards, set up a voluntarist framework to at least get states talking about burden and responsibility sharing. If we did more, we would probably fail. And in fairness to the UN, there are some scholars who would probably, at least on the surface, seem to agree with them. One of the world's true strong voices for human rights, Michael Ignatieff, who held the chair in human rights at Harvard for many years, has recently advocated a thin approach to global justice on the grounds that only a thin view of justice will attract the consensus of a pluralist world. So you can't go deeply, he now says. And perhaps even more ominously, Harlan Cohen has said there's a life cycle to multilateralism. The multilateral institutions we set up after the Second World War may have reached their zenith. They're the victims of their own success. That now really only smaller deals are going to work. Big deals are not on the table anymore. And those views, the idea that we can't assume that everybody shares any global vision and that we need little deals, not big deals, would seem to align with what the UN is suggesting. But if you actually read what these scholars have said in the refugee context, it does not lead where the UN has taken it. So for example, Ignatieff says, and I actually agree with this, he says, the real problem is that under the current view of asylum, there is no limit to how many refugees a state has to accept. Accidents of geography determine who receives refugees. So we now have, and I'll talk to you more about this in a moment, 10 countries out of the 150 that have signed the refugee treaty. 10 countries, all of them poor, receiving 60% of the world's refugees. So he's right. That is a problem. But that is a problem that we can and should fix. I agree with that. But it doesn't call for a timid vision. It calls for a big vision to fix that. And similarly, when Harlan Cohen says, I think quite rightly, look, there has to be some trickle down to the communities of international law projects, to the receiving communities. I think he's right again. But there are ways to do that. We do need to take the local interests of receiving states into account. It is not right to say to a country like Tanzania, you've got 1.5 million new people living in your country, you're already struggling to meet their needs, do right by refugees, whatever it costs your citizens. That's a non-starter. It should be a non-starter, quite frankly, because those governments have responsibility to their citizens as well. And so my answer is, let's deal with the problem of the no upward limit. Let's come up with a model that ensures that there's a fair distribution of responsibilities to protect refugees, where accidents of geography do not determine that responsibility. And let's come up with a system that actually provides benefits to the communities that receive refugees so that the goodwill that we need to sustain asylum actually can be safeguarded. That's what I would have done. The absolute last thing we need is a talk shop where people chatter and chatter and chatter, and nobody does anything to offset the burdens and responsibilities of overtaxed poor countries receiving refugees, and nobody does anything to actually guarantee to communities that when you receive refugees, this can be rebound to your benefit. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. So if you really, really wanted to fix this, you would not have come up with the bureaucratic vision of myriad conversations. You would, in my view, have come up with an optional protocol to the Refugee Convention that would allow for a collectivized implementation system that I'll describe to you in a moment, that countries could begin to sign on to, and when others saw the benefit of an insurance-based model where we all joined together and shared things where no one was ever going to be in a position of panic, I think by the time you're my age, we could well have had a good international refugee system. But that's not what the UN put on the table. So my answer is that there is a way to do this. To quote a certain famous someone, yes, we can, but we're not going to do it by hunkering down and pretending that the challenges to the vitality of human rights that Ignatieff talks about and the challenges to multilateralism that Cohen talks about can just be papered over by vague guiding principles coupled with a never-ending series of conversations. And by the way, I come to this with a heavy heart. Like most international lawyers, I have been working alongside and supporting the United Nations my entire life. But I think at some stage, those of us who care about refugees need to be honest about the institutions that we've traditionally trusted. And when they have the opportunity, as they did, the Secretary General handed them the mandate to do this. The countries of Europe were on board to do something. For the first time, we had rich countries in Europe experiencing a tiny sliver of what poor countries have always experienced with refugees. If ever there was a momentum, that was it. And it was squandered, in my view. So, what would this reform look like? What would a best defense is a good offense, robust, not thin roadmap, and yes, I'm going to use the tired metaphor, what would that roadmap look like? And again, I'm doing an extraordinary injustice to more than 100 colleagues from around the world. By the way, equal numbers from the global north, the global south, lawyers, social scientists, IGOs, NGOs, 3 rich countries, 3 poor countries that worked for 5 years to come up with this proposal. If you're interested in it, you can read it at your leisure. I'm going to give you the 10-minute version because that's about what we've got, so that you can at least see whether it's worth your time and trouble to think about an alternative. And it is audacious, it is brave, I get that. But again, remember what we're up against. Remember those starting points. The system is not doing poorly. The system of refugee protection is barely on life support right now. So the first and most critical thing, which ironically, the word access does not figure anywhere in the Global Compact on Refugees. I mean, all of you know, right? You could have the best system of justice in the world, but if you can't get into the courtroom, it really doesn't matter, right? Same thing here. If refugees cannot get to what you have on offer, don't bother, right? You would think that. So there are ideas out there for what is called assisted entry, where we can actually enable refugees to make the journeys they need to make safely without traffickers and smugglers. But more importantly, I think there's a really basic way to neutralize the problem we face now, which is that governments, and again, I know we're all thinking about the US southern border, but quite frankly, Europe was way ahead of us, and the Australians were way ahead of Europe, right? All rich countries have been engaged for the last 20 years in what I call the politics of non-entrée. The French word for the duty not to send a refugee back is non-refoulement. Non-entrée means do not let the refugee in. Make sure you keep them out. That's what we've all been doing. So what's happening right now is just a manifestation of something that's been going on for a tragically long time. Why do governments in the rich world try to keep refugees away from their jurisdiction? Because the second they touch your jurisdiction, they are 100% legally your responsibility. No one else owes them anything. No one else needs to help you. If you don't want refugees, make sure they don't touch your jurisdiction, right? It's a neat fix. And yes, there have been some important court cases in Europe, particularly in Australia. I'm working with the ACLU now on some challenges here. We will challenge these things. And yes, some judges have seen fit to strike these down. But governments rebuild in new and pernicious ways. Every time we've broken something down, a new version has taken its place. I want to break the chain. What if a refugee arriving at your territory simply had access to an international system that would guarantee him protection somewhere? That was a node of access, in other words, rather than the place where you would remain. I know some of you are already, you're getting, I don't like the sound of this. You might arrive in Miami and you might be protected in Costa Rica. I know that's not ideal, but we're not living in an ideal world. But see what would change. If there was no legal consequence for a refugee arriving at your territory other than that they would be assessed, and I'll describe in a moment, I would use a cheap, simple international assessment system. If, in other words, this was a point of entry, not the place where you would remain, you would have no incentive to spend the billions of dollars we now spend every year to keep refugees away, because there would be no consequence for you of their arrival. It would be the equivalent of a transit zone in an airport. Now that leads to the second point, which is upon arrival, we would have internationally run, normally group-based refugee status assessment. Tragically, we put people through very fancy systems, costing on average $40,000 per person in the developed world. We spend that kind of money to figure out that a Syrian is a refugee. I mean, hello, right? This is not rocket science. The overwhelming majority of refugees in the world are recognizable as such by their group membership and their provenance. There are some for whom a detailed inquiry is required. The UN has operated efficient group-based status determination around the world in poor countries for a long time, and it works for most refugees. We could swap to a system like that, in which the UN works within this reception facility in whatever country a refugee can get to. I want to be clear about that. The refugee gets out, she gets to wherever she can get. The consequence of arriving in Kenya or in the United States is identical. You walk into the very same refugee protection system. And when we identify you as a refugee, you would be allocated to a place of what I call protection for duration of risk. I'll describe that more in a moment, but it will be a country normally, and I don't shy away from this, normally in your region of origin, because in your region of origin is where you're more likely quickly to get back on your feet, to be able to be culturally and economically self-supporting, and where you have a chance to think about the prospects of repatriation, to stay in touch with your networks, and otherwise keep the hope of going home alive. The cultural and functional compatibility, said the social scientists in our study, including refugee social scientist, by the way, argues that if something is not permanent, if it's going to be provisional, it is better to enable the refugee to be in a place where the skills that she brings to the table are valued rather than requiring her to completely retool for something that may not be forever. And so the initial assignment would be to a country in which refugee rights are respected. That's the litmus test, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But it would probably not be, coming to the United States or Canada or Europe as your place of protection for duration of risk. Quite frankly, it's a very inefficient use of our resources, and if we provided what was required closer to home, refugees wouldn't need to use traffickers and smugglers to get what they're entitled to. Now that links to the third point, empowerment. So the Refugee Convention does allow refugees to be briefly detained while we vet their identity, whether they present a security concern, whether they are in fact a refugee. But the drafters of the convention talked about a period of days or weeks. I want to be super clear, one little segue into American policy I can't resist. The routine detention of asylum seekers by the United States is 100% internationally illegal. I want also to say that was equally true under the regime of President Obama as it is under that of President Trump. This country has never respected the duty that requires, once identity and security concerns are vetted, that it is illegal to detain that person for the currency of their asylum process. So quite frankly, we're having this discussion right now about refugees on the southern border. I'm not saying it's a good solution, but it is kind of interesting that one of the byproducts is those refugees who have been sent back to Mexico are not only not detained, they're actually working with permits. And they would have been in jail in the United States for 2, 3, 4 years while we, in our supposedly humane system, process their applications. The system I'm discussing would be without any detention upon arrival in your country for protection of duration of risk. We would move you around the world, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We've done it before, we can do it again. We make sure that when the refugee arrives, there are no constraints on movement, there are no constraints on the right to work or to educate kids. That's the price for the support that I'm going to describe in a moment that these states will receive. We enable refugees to get out there and to look after themselves. That's what they want. Some of the right-wing rhetoric that suggests that refugees are all after a welfare check. I mean, honestly, having done this for now more than 35 years, I have yet to meet that person who wouldn't prefer to have the chance to lead a dignified life. We make it nearly impossible for them to do that, not just here, but around the world. Countries need to understand that when they do this, it not only keeps refugees alive and dignified, but it's good for the host state. Uganda, for example, several years ago, moved away from its policy of mandatorily detaining refugee claimants in camps. Once they did that, within 3 years, 21% of urban refugees owned businesses that employed other people, and 40% of the people they employed were Ugandans. So the point is, refugees can be an engine for development if you liberate their human potential, if you do not treat them like criminals. And that's what this system would do. And that's the quid pro quo for the fourth pillar, support. You've got to make protection doable for poor countries. The current system of forcing poor countries to come with begging bowls every time refugees arrive is not sustainable. They are not going to trust you when you say that you are going to pay the bills, because quite frankly, we have not paid the bills in many, many circumstances. Where not only have they gone into debt to look after refugees, but they've paid huge prices vis-a-vis what they could offer their own citizens. This model provides for a guarantee of financial support, not only for the costs of processing refugees, but also for, and this goes to the Harlan-Cohen point, link refugees to the communities, for a series of development startup grants that link refugees to host communities and enable the sort of Ugandan experiment that I described to flourish. The only contingency that poor countries would face is respect for the refugee rights in the treaty they've signed on to. If they do that, the funds are guaranteed. Now here's the really interesting part. The economists in our study found that everything I've just described, the cost of processing refugees through a common system, moving them to a country of protection for duration of risk, and providing all of the funds needed by the countries receiving them, including the economic startup grants, significantly less than what we now spend to process the refugee claims of the 15% of refugees who get to rich countries, and that money would no longer be needed under the system. In other words, not $1 is required to make the shift that is not already being spent. We just redeploy it. And the last and most critical pillar is solutions. When I talked about the 13 million refugees waiting, there's not one word for them in the Global Compact. They're still going to be waiting. What we have done is to come up with a modality under which we enable the two so-called preferred solutions, either repatriation going back home or local integration, by putting you in a place for 5 years where either of those two options is more tenable. We need to keep the numbers manageable, and we also like to recognize that people typically, I know this hurts Americans' feelings, but again, most refugees actually don't want to live with us. Most refugees wish they hadn't had to leave where they were. And it's really snobbish to imagine that they all really want to live with us. It's just not true. I mean, segue, circular migration from here to Mexico, from Mexicans who were given permanent status in America, 20% go home within 5 years with permanent status. So believe it or not, guys, when you talk to refugees, I mean, sure, some would like to try something different, and some need to be somewhere different, but the majority don't. On average, within 5 years, historically over the last quarter century, within 5 years, about a quarter of refugees go home and about a quarter of refugees locally integrate. And I think that's a good thing. And this system keeps that alive. But at the 5-year point, which is sort of a magic number, the psychologists in our study, again, including refugee psychologists, 2 guys who had actually lived in refugee camps for a decade, so they know what they were talking about. The studies show that if you actually give refugees their rights, you don't treat them like prisoners. The idea of 5 years in protection for duration of risk is not so long as to cause psychosocial harm at a level that would be irremediable. There will be some people who need an immediate solution, unaccompanied minors, victims of torture, but for most refugees, you could live in your region of origin with safety, working, educating your kids, etc., without a permanent status for up to 5 years with no serious psychosocial harm. And we've used that in the model. But at the 5-year point, and here's where the revolution comes, at the 5-year point, some of you are saying, so what the hell are rich countries going to do in this model? Well, here's the answer. At the 5-year point, every refugee who has not gone home or been locally integrated is entitled to resettlement. The part of the system that is now completely moribund becomes the critical center point for what extra-regional states, rich countries predominantly, would do. That would be their main job. So instead of doing asylum in the traditional expensive sense for 15% of the world's refugees, we end up doing resettlement instead. Instead of the paltry 100,000 or so resettlement places now offered, this becomes the core job of states outside the region. Here's another interesting number, which was not true when we did the survey or when we did the study 20 some odd years ago. Right now, OECD states, rich countries, receive about 1.65 million asylum applications a year, collectively. Under the model, we would need 1.7 million resettlement places, almost identical. So we swap out asylum for resettlement. Resettlement, by the way, a job that the Global South has done very poorly. They're very generous and good at providing limited term protection, but apart from South Africa, for example, in Africa, no one offers permanent status. That's something we're pretty good at. We know how to integrate people. We built a country around it. If people came and came permanently, that would be a job, I think, that is a better fit. And we get rid of the purgatory of 13 million people behind barbed wire for 3 generations. So could we do it? Some of you should be asking yourself that. I'm going to let history be my guide. In the 1920s, when we first invented refugee law, by the way, this is almost the birthday of international refugee law, almost happy 100th birthday. In those days, we let an office called the Nansen Office actually do what I've just described. Vet who was a refugee, issue them with what was called a Nansen passport that everybody simply agreed to recognize. Cost efficient, simple, smooth. The Cold War caused that to break down, but the Cold War idea of wanting control over, I want to get to admit you as a refugee, long gone. Who's looking to admit refugees to score political points anymore? And yet the Refugee Convention lives on. After the Second World War, what was then called the International Refugee Organization did the distribution of refugees that I've just described. They had indeed their own fleet of ships that even in the 1950s, for God's sake, moved 1.5 million refugees around the world to new homes in the Americas, Australasia, Southern Africa, and elsewhere. You can do it. I mean, in the age of air transport, 100 times easier. Could we all work together? Could we have a collectivized system? Well, again, the 1970s, we did it. What was called the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Vietnamese Boat People, we had an agreement among states in the region that if they would receive people arriving on boats like this one, we would then resettle out the ones that they couldn't accommodate to make sure everybody participated in a common system. It worked. We've done similar experiments in Latin America and in Africa since then. Can you possibly imagine ramped up resettlement? And I understand, in the current moment, you think not in America, but I mean, as easily as he could reduce the number, he can increase the number. This is, as an expatriate Canadian, I had to put up a picture of our hunky prime minister just so that you can sort of see the comparison. You may or may not remember, when Justin Trudeau came in his first term, and the Syrian refugee crisis was in full swing, he did something that caused his bureaucrats nearly to resign en masse. He said, I want you to resettle in 3 months more refugees than you've ever resettled in a full year. 25,000 to be precise in 3 months. And this is Canada, this is not the United States, a country with 1/10 the Americans' population. They did it. And they did it with a process that sacrificed nothing on security vetting. Instead of a series of sequential steps, they ran 7 steps simultaneously, and they achieved the result, touch wood, thus far without a single security incident from anyone who's come in onto that flow. You can do it if you put your mind to it. So this would, I think, be a better system for everyone. It would be better, and because I'm a lapsed Catholic, everything is in threes, for refugees. These are the 3 key points. First of all, and again, I understand that this is a different way of thinking about refugees rather than just the human beings that we encounter. It's predicated on the equal moral worth of the refugees we don't see and the ones we do see. And that's a hard thing for some people. But I think we need to think globally in this way. So refugees first would not need to put their lives on the line through smugglers and traffickers to get access to solid protection. Again, walking across the border from Somalia into Kenya gets you the same result that getting on a pirate ship headed for Europe would get you. Secondly, protection would really be the empowering rights regarding protection that the Refugee Convention calls for. rights to mobility and work and education. I mean, there's even rights to self-employment and copyright protection, for God's sake. It's all about refugees doing for themselves. We need to get back to that. No more refugee camps or leaving refugees stuck in urban slums. And third, and most important, every refugee, not just the 15% disproportionately young, male, and mobile who get to countries like this, every refugee, by the 5-year point, gets a durable solution. No more purgatory of 13 million people waiting for 20 plus years. For poor countries, the ones that host 85% of the world's refugees, number one, they would no longer be required to beg for the charity of rich countries, but would be guaranteed the funds they need to protect refugees. Secondly, those funds would go not just to refugees, but to the communities that host them, so everyone benefits from the presence of refugees. And third, host countries would not face the cruel punishment that we now inflict on them. If they leave their doors open, they're stuck with the refugees forever, right? Because no one else owes anything. At the 5-year point, they have a guarantee that the rest of the world steps in and provides resettlement to those that either can't go home or be locally integrated. And yes, would be better for countries like the United States. It would be better for countries like us because first, the assignment mechanism that I've described would undermine the smuggling market and reduce the use of the refugee channel for economic migration. There's no point in coming to Miami if you don't have any reason to believe that you'll end up in the United States. Why would you spend thousands of dollars for that? Secondly, and I think equally important, industrialized countries would have the time they need to vet security concerns while refugees are in that 5-year protection for duration of risk phase. They have plenty of time to ask the questions, the kind of rhetoric we're now hearing, which is they just rock up at the southern border, God knows who they are, all of that would go away. You'd have plenty of time to investigate those concerns. And third, the focus on resettlement would give wealthier countries a role that I think is an easier social fit than is temporary protection. We're not so good. Germany tried this 20 years ago. Rich countries are not so good at having temporary people in their midst. We're better at integrating people and having them buy into our communities for the long haul. That's a good fit because most southern countries feel the opposite. We need both in order to make the system work. So I'm conscious of the time ticking down, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to skip some of what I would answer by way of answers to my critics on the assumption that you're going to come up with the same criticisms. I do want to say one word about the main ethical concern in this for all of us. And I get it. The main ethical concern is that it sacrifices the right to choose of an asylum seeker where he gets to go. And I hear that. And I've argued for it very, very strongly in many contexts. But I want to be clear that that right really only works for about 15% of the world's refugees now, to start with. Most refugees don't have the resources. Many refugees, women in particular, have family obligations or otherwise that preclude them from leaving. It's a system now that privileges a small subset of refugees over the majority. If we believe in the equal moral integrity and worth of all refugees, and if this system would actually make sure that all refugees, wherever they are, would get protection worthy of the name and a durable solution if they can't go home in 5 years, then quite frankly, call me a utilitarian, I don't mind. I think the greatest good for the greatest number does suggest that a small sacrifice in terms of what some refugees now get is worth it to make sure that everybody gets what they actually need. As one of the rapporteurs to our project put it, Bill Frelick, who heads up the Refugee Program for Human Rights Watch, said, he said, you know what Jim really wants is everybody to have a bicycle instead of a few people having a Mercedes. And that's exactly right. That is what I want. But we can talk about that. What I really want you to remember, though, is this idea that the perfect is the enemy of the good. If we're struggling for something perfect, then you need to keep in mind that right now what we've just agreed to does not eliminate barriers to access. It doesn't get people to a place dependably where they're safe. It certainly does not give them rights regarding protection. There's no guarantee of responsibility sharing, and there's no guaranteed solution. So please don't start tabula rasa and sort of absolutist about this. Start with where we are. We're in a hellhole right now for most refugees. The operational mechanism for what the UN agreed last year is called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. Lovely name. I actually call it the Contingent Refugee Assistance Project, and not only because the acronym I think fits. What we have is not a global compact, and look at the word on refugees, not for refugees, on refugees. What we actually have is a global cop-out on refugees. And I'm asking all of you here to think hard about the morality of that easy fix, and to think equally hard about making sure that people who have no choice but to flee are treated with dignity wherever they are. These kind of principles, I think, matter. We can do it, but it requires all of us to engage it, because this is not going to happen if smart people like you aren't putting hard ideas on the table. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take questions, 10 minutes?
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes, and then Jim will probably be willing to stick around. And
I'll stick around as long as any of you want to talk.
We have a microphone. Just hold on one sec. Pass it around. Here we go. Ready?
Thank you.
I'll let you. Sure.
Thank you for coming, but I also believe your proposal is bold and laudable. As an African, I really resonate with what some of the things you've said. So my question to you is, given the situation in the Dadaab camp in Kenya, which I think has been one of the foremost failure for our global community. I know recently it was surpassed in terms of population by the Kuta Palong Cox in Beza in Bangladesh in terms of population. So my question is, you mentioned it, African or developing countries just coming with begging bowls, and I think that is not a way to go. That is not sustainable. So what proposal do you really see will work in terms of the administrative form of it, in terms of giving these developed countries for people to stay where they are? Because I believe the solution is that empower those societies so the people can stay where they because most of them want to stay in their country. So I just want to get your own view.
So, I think it is basically that. You could have an optional protocol for the international lawyers in the room. It's what we did, for example, with the Civil and Political Covenant. We created an optional mechanism whereby states could opt into an adjudicative process. Not everybody was ready for it. Some were, some weren't. And over time, most have. Similarly here, I think what we do is we say, we open an optional protocol built upon those pillars, and when the required minimum number to make it functional is in place, we operationalize it. You could begin at a regional level, but the problem is, everybody talks about, doing it at a regional level. The problem is, and you would appreciate this, a lot of what's really being proposed is that poor countries share with poor countries. And I think that's a non-starter. When we've got the billions of dollars that we do already in the asylum system that could be redeployed, not to do that, as the UN failed to do, is quasi-criminal, in my view, because that is essential to making this work. We need the money to assess status properly, to get people to safe places, to relocate them to resettlement states if and when they can't go home. All of this requires money. But again, isn't it amazing that the money is actually less than what we spend right now just to run systems that serve fewer than 15% of the population? So I actually think the idea is, I've talked about a quadrumvirate of leaders, maybe, the leaders of countries like, Kenya and Pakistan that have done a good job by refugees, maybe Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau, they all get together and they pound the table and they get their colleagues to talk about this in ways that the UN won't, because quite frankly, it has a self-interest in the current system. It serves the bureaucratic imperative very effectively. That's my worry. Yes, ma'am.
I know that all these countries are very poor. Could we help them economically so the people will stay there? I know there are political also, sometimes you are persecuted politically, but besides that, I think economic is a factor for
Yeah.
me.
So I'm not really trying to address the economic migration question. I'm really talking, as Avi said, about people who face the risk of being persecuted. I mean, to me, that's the number one criterion. These are people who literally will be dead if we don't help them. I think the migration issue is tougher. There's a separate compact on migration. All I would say is there are a lot of people who would argue, I think with some logic, that actually handing out money is much less good than what is called circular migration, allowing people to go abroad and work for periods of years. Remittances are much more effective as foreign aid than is direct development assistance. So there's a much bigger conversation, but my concern right now is to enable people who literally would be persecuted for who they are or what they believe to get to safety and find a home if they can't go back to their own. Yeah, sir.
What prevents the country of entry from cherry-picking the desirable refugees and then sending on the less desirable ones to the country of
So it would have no voice in this. It would be the international agency that does the work, and this is the part I couldn't get into. There's a whole series of formula for both burden sharing money, responsibility sharing people. Oxfam has actually put out a gorgeous formula based on the fragility index, debt, population arable space. They've actually come up with the numbers that would be a starting place for the discussion about prima facie obligations. And so the UN agency would become, in a rough sense, the Securities Exchange Commission of refugee law that would allocate within the quotas. There is also, I want to put this out there for those of you who are already hating me about, taking away from refugees. One of the most brilliant parts of the project, which I did not come up with, is called preference matching. Already being used in the UK to resettle refugees in different parts of the United Kingdom, where both host communities and refugees indicate a variety of factors about where they would prefer to go or who they'd prefer to receive. And yes, lest I sound like a Google boy, an algorithm generates prima facie matches, and it's working now in the UK. Refugees are being resettled into host communities that are welcoming to them and that meet maybe not all, but most of their hopes and expectations. There are ways to manage that system that it is not inhumane. But no, we would not let each country do it, because you're right, that would be cherry picking, and that would then not enable us to do what we want. That's what we do right now. The US, Canada, and Australia cherry pick the best refugees from around the world, quite frankly. Canada's the worst. I'm a native, so I can say this. Canada goes in and grabs the best and the brightest, and then stands up and proclaims how wonderful it is. That's what it's done for a long time. So your concern is totally serious. Oh, you've got the mic. Yep.
I have a question on that same issue of what's being sacrificed by your plan. Let's say somebody is, after the 5-year point, resettled to Chile, but the person really wants to live in Brazil. Is there anything that would prevent the person after being resettled in Chile from applying to Brazil?
No. But again, that would be a consensual change of residence. One of the interesting points is, and actually Latin America is an interesting one, as Latin America moves more and more toward at least employment-based openness to migration. This is already happening in Europe. Refugees do, in fact, move from the places to which they've been assigned to other places under the freedom of movement regimes. There's nothing to stop it, but I would not compel it. I want to get people into a safe place. I want to get them to a place where they're leading a dignified life, and I want to maximize their choice. But I don't want to reify choice to the extent that it overcomes the base concern for the 85% that we now completely ignore. That makes sense, yeah. But there's nothing to stop the...
You'd go back then to whatever the law of, in my instance, Brazil would be.
Yep.
And the person would just follow the regular Brazilian channels, might or might not get admitted.
Correct, but again, we are living in an era, and Latin America is a perfect example of this, where more and more migratory freedom as among states of a given region is possible. And so, but initially, let's get them somewhere where they're not going to be hurt. And after that, we can worry about where you'd prefer to be and why. It would probably be the case that for everyone who wanted to go to Brazil, there was a Brazilian who wanted to go to Chile, and it could easily happen. That's already happening in Europe now, so there's no reason not to build that in.
Okay, we are unfortunately at the hour. For those of you who can stay afterward, please come forward and pose your questions to Professor Hathaway, but please join me in thanking